Good. So just, Marcus, to start off with, I really wanted you to look at, because obviously we're celebrating 20 years, and I'm aware that a lot of our journeys in the kind of lifestyle design industries have kind of gone parallel, and they overlap and interlink. And I just wanted you to have a kind of a muse about the last 20 years as you see how culturally, design-wise, in terms of the sectors we work in, has changed, and what has been the benefit of the change and the negative sides of those changes.
Okay, is that the question? You want me to answer it now?
Yeah. I know there's a lot of sub clauses in that one, but I think you're probably used like me to having to deal with that from clients.
Yeah, well, I wanted to say I remember coming to visit you guys in Bethnal Green. It must have been 16 odd years ago. I just started Icon magazine. You guys had been running for a couple of years. Do you remember? And we talked about a storm in a teacup that felt like the biggest crisis in my career at the time. But you were right. It was like, it'll blow over. I remember thinking, oh, these guys are really interesting, and what they're doing is really interesting and a bit weird, and I don't really understand it. And I remember around that time, also separately, we wrote a story about the rise of the trend forecaster, and
remember it
in Icon magazine, and the illustration was somebody holding up a digital camera in a show or something like that to take a picture of it with the screen, because at that time that kind of gesture of holding the camera up in front of you so you could see the image.
Yeah, and not looking at content in the yes, indeed.
It was a new thing, because before then we'd all held the cameras up to our eyes, and you didn't tend to take pictures in public in events anyway, because it was weird. All of that behavior has been completely normalized now. There's been an information tsunami. We're partly responsible for that, and you're partly responsible for another aspect of it. And it felt like, looking back, it felt like we were we'd stumbled on a kind of new continent, and we, from different sides, we were sort of hacking our way through the jungle. And now it's kind of civilized and controlled, maybe a bit too civilized and controlled, but the landscape has changed immeasurably. It feels quite sweet thinking back to those days when no one had heard of design and no one had heard of forecasting.
Yeah. And I guess it was also where they were also seen to be added values. We're now, even yesterday, I was having a conversation with a pretty major developer, and you're talking to the board, and the second and third words out of their mouth was about design and culture, which I thought was really indicative of how both the importance of the sector, but also it's both real value and perceived value in terms of cultural discourse, because a lot of what they're trying to know is, how do I get people back to a building? And when we now agree that nobody needs to go back because they have to work at a desk, it's become a cultural issue. It's become a creative productivity issue, a design issue, which in itself is, I think, a huge change from how it used to be, when you'd have to talk to clients about the relevance and roles of the stuff that you were doing at the time.
Yeah, is that a question?
It's more like a build on what you were saying in terms of
I was
that shift over the last couple of years.
Talking about trying to get people back to buildings and places. My London Design Festival this day consisted of one meeting in West London, after which I wandered around for about half an hour, came home. But in that half an hour, I met a property developer who was being shown around and was about to open something down in Brompton. And he said to me, do you think that design is being taken more seriously in this country now than before? And I said, overall, I think it's taken less seriously. If you look at the stuff you see on the news, you go for a drive in the countryside, you look at what's being thrown up, I think that in many ways standards are falling. But you're right about those kind of key critical particularly urban spaces, where there's a need to get people back to spaces, where there's a need to get people to come to this space rather than that one, that square rather than that square, that tower block rather than the other one. I think design is finally being taken properly seriously in those aspects, because it does make a difference. Whereas before, I think people paid lip service to it. They bandied around this idea design as a kind of veneer. But if you look at some of the private developments in London now, like King's Cross, I mean, the quality is extraordinary. I mean, private developers are the new public local authorities when they do it right.
Yeah, it is getting it. It's interesting because if I think about design and, our coverage of design is always based on two things. One is to look at, what's new in terms of what's coming through culturally, but also, and I think that I was kind of aware of it over the past year, what are the indicators of shift in, the bigger landscape? So we will use it, I guess, as almost like a forecasting tool and an indicator and a weather vane. And it was interesting to see, where circular economy, circular design, like 5 years ago, was still a part of discourse, not a part of manufacture and a part of concept. Now it's part of the core value. And I'm thinking when I sit with clients who work across all of these industries where housing design is fundamental to their ability to shift and pivot forward, I don't have to have that awkward conversation about sustainability and its relation to profit or circular, or, for example, the use of new materials or recycling. So again, I think it's interesting how design has now inserted itself into the commercial language and made that kind of conversation that I guess people like ourselves as futurists having to suggest the future could be about this without being ridiculed, which is inevitably what happens. It has become easier. And I'm just wondering now, from your looking at design as it is now, what are the hints it's offering us of things to come? What do you think are the other things that design is telling us about tomorrow?
I think that we're on the verge, like you talk about that breakthrough of design being something you had to explain, you spend 10 minutes explaining to people, and then it became part of the discourse. Sustainability, you had to spend 10 minutes convincing people you weren't a nutter before sustainability. I think that now one of the things that's happening is a sudden awareness of the importance of ecosystems, natural processes, and undesigned, like wildness of nature. I think it's parallel. So there's a massive understanding that it's just human civilization has separated itself from the natural world, often through design, and that in order to tidy up the mess or mitigate the potential disaster, design has to sort of somehow decouple itself from capitalism and look over the other side of the fence, where there is no design, but stuff just happens on its own. Nature recovers itself.
Yeah.
And so to allow wilderness back, both in a physical sense and a metaphorical sense, that the humanity's drive to dominate nature has led to us almost throttling the life out of nature. And so you don't need to design nature back, you need to just back off and let it
pull it back off. It's because I'm thinking about office design. People talk about the biophilic office. So suddenly what used to be, and I notice you have a plant in the background, what used to be a plant has now become a forest, and it's also been used as a core ecological system or shift in how we design, not just the atrium, which is always that questionable space from the 70s that made it into the 21st century, but now I keep looking at designs for buildings in the future, and they've been greenified, they've been turned into these kind of rewilding spaces and reserves. And I guess my question is, with the this push to nature, are we yet again in risk of simply seeing nature as a tool for improving design and not nature as something that we really need to reassess in relation to ourselves? So that the notion that we're just pulling it into the city in a, it's not, rewilding to me is nice. I'm not sure in itself it's going to either save nature or save the planet. So I'm just wondering, are we yet again fetishizing something that's a bit nostalgic without actually trying to get to the bottom of why we need to bother about it?
Well, I wouldn't use nostalgia as a negative word, because I think there's a chance that collectively, humans, as humans, during lockdown, during the pandemic, where we were being assaulted by this invisible enemy, where we were being told we couldn't leave our houses, I mean, it became almost a cliche that we all craved nature. I was thinking this morning, actually, I wonder how universal that was. I wonder if people, in tower blocks also crave nature, or was it just us middle classes who craved an escape? But was that something deep in our psyches that realized that we'd built these amazing civilizations, these cities, but it isn't enough, and that the thing that's missing is not more civilization and more technology and more design, but actually none of it, or at least the opportunity to experience none of it? So, I mean, I'm really fascinated by the rewilding movement, not because on its own it provides a solution, but because it's kind of really radical that you just say, look, do nothing. Like literally,
Yeah.
we do not need the human hand or the human brain. It doesn't need an intervention from us, which has been the whole history of design. Is like somehow we need to control, we need to shape, we need to nurture, we need to garden. The idea that we garden. In my garden, it's actually, it looks very pretty, but biologically it's a semi-desert.
Right.
As I've learned
I
since
guess
reading all these books about rewilding.
I got I'm going to use an American term here. I'm conflicted about rewilding because I kind of go on one level, I get it, but I'm also on the other side. I really believe that in some ways it's reflective of a bigger malaise. So if you think, I was thinking about the romantics, the kind of the romantic idea to return to a nostalgic England or otherness where, you allowed nature to flourish. Yes, you had things in the landscape that reminded you of things in the past, but essentially it was about allowing things to become what they were, and you celebrate that. And I kind of go, gosh, as a futurist, am I having to deal with nostalgia again in a different format? So when I see rewilding, I go, it is in some ways uncomfortable, because if I'm thinking about the current pandemic, the more effectively I shield myself from nature, the safer I will be, because it's nature that's created the bloody illness, and it's nature that's passing it on. I mean, people are natural, they're not aliens. So I kind of go, I'm not sure about the conviction that I need to retreat to nature, but also I kind of worry. And I was reading an interview with Dyson, who I find, problematic as an individual because of his voting patterns. But he raised a point. He said, if you rewilded England, how do you feed England? He said, we're fundamentally faced with the same problem again, that if we go back to this bucolic, sentimental landscape where we're not managing, regulating, designing, and he used this term, he said, landscape farming is landscape by design. It's designing nature to do a more effective job. He said, surely we then risk the same questions about how do we feed, how do we nurture, how do we sustain people and even the countryside if we're now being asked to rewild it at such a rate.
Well, I think that that's not being futuristic enough, actually, because I think that the notion that tractors should be driving up and down fields spraying chemicals on them so that you can plant a monocrop at the exclusion of all other plants, damage the subsoil, have rainwater runoff, pollute the rivers. That's not futurism. That is nostalgia for a past mode of how to feed civilizations. The future of feeding civilizations is not sticking things in the ground and hoping that it's going to rain. That is nostalgic. Like Dyson's being nostalgic for a kind of a sort of landowner notion of agriculture that is still relevant, because we haven't come up with the tech to grow things in other ways yet, but it will become irrelevant
to do the other. Yeah.
And then also,
I think it's
and back to rewilding again. It's not that no one's proposing that we rewild the entire country, but it forces us to make a decision of what kind of future we want. Do we want a future where there is no ecosystem, or do we want a future where there is ecosystem, thriving ecosystem, and human civilization? It's not like we only have one. The question is, do we want a bit of both? And I don't think anyone would say, let's get rid of all the wild creatures and tough it out on our own in our little bubbles. I think that's people realize we've got to that point where it's almost too late to save ecosystems, and ecosystems need constructive action in order to preserve them for the future, because they are the future gene banks, they are the future medical banks, they are the future sources of new proteins and new molecules and new cures and so on and so forth. But the way to save them is to do nothing and let them save themselves. So I think it's quite an existential mind shift that's required to sort of get your head around what people are talking about when they're saying these kind of things.
Yeah, I suppose I would look at the human force on the planet and the things that we call nature as being the same thing. So I kind of go, men, women, whatever, are part of the natural ecosystem. And I can have rewilding on one hand, and I agree with you absolutely. If you think about how farming works, it is the most rapacious for the least return. We're also focusing on the wrong things. So I always imagine, I found it interesting. I was looking at a debate in East Anglia about Sellafield C. And I remember, visiting once a friend in East Anglia, and they were raging about the offshore array and how it was damaging their nostalgic view of the ocean and of the singular horizon. And I met them recently, and they suddenly were singing the praises of renewables and wind farms. And I thought, well, maybe what we also need is to put in a third unpalatable threat from the future, like Sellafield C, to remind us that we actually do need to move into a future and move into it in a different way. And I think rewilding actually reminded me of that, because in some ways it's what everybody wants, because we want to get back to it, but we realize the ideal is not going to work. You have to have something that sits in the middle. And I noticed that along rewilding, when I looked at the corridors and I looked at the people doing it, they sit equally valuably and well and embracing renewables and alternatives. And I'm looking at one chap, he was saying, look, I'm developing a rewilding system here. I'm developing nano farming here. And I was thinking that's the kind of beauty of those futures where the debate isn't about the science or the nostalgia. The debate is about the balance. And his view, and I think increasingly a lot of people's view, is that we can use the science to do certain things more effectively and let nature do what she does, however we create the pronoun for her in a way that is equally effective. And I just wanted to take, if we're looking 20 years ahead, what do you think will be the big changes that we'll have to embrace? We're seeing rewilding now as it's starting, and I always think about something like organic, which started as a very low base, and now organic and vegan have become kind of, fairly kind of common things to talk about without people thinking you're Prince Charles. So we're now okay on that. What do you think of the things that potentially are unpalatable now, like GM, for example, used to be, synthetic biology, nanotech, stem cell, the kind of gene editing? Do we see these things becoming part of our kind of a horticultural mix that we can deploy to make this place better over the next, well, not decade, the next millennia?
Well, I mean, if you're talking 20 years ahead, we're sort of talking about potentially apocalyptic time frame. I do worry that the coronavirus pandemic is not like a temporary blip from reality, but maybe the start of a kind of seven years of plague kind of thing. That maybe civilization is going through a phase where it's just going to be buffeted regularly by these
storms of
threats. Yeah. I mean, because 20 years time, I mean, we know now that climate change has started. It's not something that's kind of on the horizon. At some point, sea levels are going to rise and the oceans are going to warm and the ice cap's going to melt. We're in that process, and that process is going to throw up all kinds of surprises, population migrations, areas changing dramatically in terms of climate and landscape. Farmers not being able to grow the crops that they've used to been growing. That's going to have like huge cultural implications. I mean, what I was doing a discussion with the steering group about French design policy, and they were talking about, how can we make design sustainable. And I was saying, but the problem is going to be making culture sustainable when the symbols of Frenchness when you can't grow champagne in Champagne anymore. That's a cultural crisis,
really,
as well as being an agricultural crisis, as well as being an ecological crisis. So I think people holding on to their cultural identities in a time of immense change is going to be really, really difficult. I think access to information is going to become like a cultural battleground, because you see that already. You know, we're holding on to sort of the rational, balanced media view of things, whereas there's this kind of army of people who don't want people to have access to reliable information. They want them to have access to bad information or propaganda or just nonsense information. And so there's going to be the potential infantilization of discussion. And also, you know, I think there's an acceptance among like certain people that we probably can't solve all these problems, but there's also a danger that we'll jump onto the wrong solutions because they sound right. Like plastic. Like, okay, so we know that, you know, Earth, geological process on Earth spent millions of years taking carbon out of the atmosphere and laying it down as coal and tar and natural gas and things like that. And now civilization, if you look back, our kind of key, the main thing we've achieved is to dig all that stuff up and put it back in the atmosphere. Yet people are more concerned about plastic, but you could look at plastic as being a great way of sequestering carbon, because if it doesn't become plastic, it becomes something that we burn. So now everyone's running around trying to find like biodegradable plastic. But if plastic biodegrades, it releases carbon dioxide and methane into the atmosphere. So it's like,
worst kind.
Maybe the paradigm is to turn all fossil fuels into plastic and then dump them in the ocean. I mean, that's a kind of unpalatable thing to say, but at least you're keeping it in the ground in a way.
Yeah, and also I think if you think about what I call those unpalatable scenarios, you know, if you look at the growth of feeding in the oceans, are we trying to answer or ask the wrong questions? You know, could I develop efficient extraction systems or entrapment systems that are part of an ecosystem that will allow us to effectively mine, to sequestrate, or also, as somebody said, to use alternatively? So again, if it's there, our focus should not be necessarily on removing it. The issue is how can you use it more effectively, and how can you use it in a way that's allowing the planet to manage its systems, you know, more sustainably. And I think that probably, to your point, sometimes we fear asking those questions because they're not just unfashionable, but they open you to attacks that you're seen to be, you know, damaging nature, or you're seen to be, you know, right wing. Because I always think that the accusation now is not so much that it's so that you're seen to be right wing or whatever. And I think that a lot of the solutions I was looking at recently being proposed have sort of been suppressed because they are uncomfortable truths about how we may have to live the planet in the future, and how we may have to recondition the civilization. And as you said, the notion that, you know, it's sustainability isn't a product or a category thing. It is a cultural and societal. And I'm not sure that if we're asking people to save plastic bags or not to use them, that's actually asking them to do the right thing, or even the most useful long-term thing. Is there something that you have seen from your work on you know, writing about design, thinking about it, working with people across categories? Do you think there are solutions there that you're seeing coming through that could be taken and magnified on a bigger scale?
But just first of all, just one more thought about sustainability, because you sort of started off this conversation sort of slightly railing against nostalgia. But the thing is, the whole notion of sustainability is wedded to the notion of nostalgia, because it implies you want to keep things the same. You want to have your cake and eat it. You want a better life. You want more progress, more technology, but you want it to stay the same. It's like that's not a coherent position for someone to take. So the whole notion of sustainability is wrong-headed in the first place, because either you want things to stay the same or you don't. They can't stay the same and change. You can't. So, and then in terms of, back to your question of what things that can scale up, I mean, I think we're still waiting for the tipping point on electric power. There's the UK, in order to meet its kind of decarbonisation targets, it needs to kind of strip out all of the gas boilers in every house and replace it with an electric one. That's not going to happen until the electric solution is like half the price of the gas solution, and then suddenly there'll be a stampede. And the same with electric vehicles. So there's the technology has to prove itself. I think food as well. I mean, we're all hypocrites, aren't we? Because we all condemn the destruction of the rainforest, and then I can guarantee that when our shopping arrives, there'll be 10 products in that shopping bag that are somehow related to the destruction of the Amazon, whether it's beef fed on soya. So I think farming is, agriculture and farming is one of the areas that I mean, and until every last tree has been chopped down, that's the end game of current agricultural industry. And then, biotech and medicine, we're seeing design can't offer a solution to coronavirus. Unfortunately, medicine can. So design can temporarily keep people safe by allowing, wider corridors and balconies and so on and so forth. But unfortunately, game's up for design. It doesn't have the solutions to that kind of pandemic level thing. You've got to defer to the scientists and the medics, I'm afraid.
Yeah, I kind of laugh because I always think they are the designers. I always think, it's always about efficiency, it's about effectiveness, it's about creative leaps, it's about, sometimes challenging solutions. It's about maybe something that we haven't even thought about. And I feel that in itself, they are the kind of core values that I would expect good design to function on. And I notice now that even the phrase that's been used by a lot of the pharmaceutical businesses in working in that sector is one chap who was the CEO said, we're trying to design an effective vaccine. And I quite like that idea, again, that the language is not just transmutable, but also I understood exactly what they were saying. They really understood that while we can bang things together, that's just how things happen serendipitously. We have to design these things. And I kind of feel that moving forward, a lot of solutions, we will have to design them, and therefore we have to think about the possible, the kind of probable, the ideal, and then, as somebody said, the implausible things coming through. And I always think that's what designers do sometimes when they wake up. They think, well, rather than thinking what could be, they think what should be. Let's try this. And I think a lot of the time we allow the future to overtake us, and we become, as somebody said, you're either a passenger or a pilot. You're either somebody flying the thing, or you're somebody sitting back and just hoping, fuck, I'll get there. And I think increasingly we are seeing the need to design this thing and to get it right, rather than leaving it to chance. And I'm just wondering, is that my fanciful idea of how the future should be or could be, or whether you've seen that as well, that people are thinking, fuck, we've got to get this done ourselves. We can't leave it up to other people.
I don't know though, because I do think that there's a kind of collective failure of vision in the design world. I mean, one of the most powerful things I've heard, I was doing a talk at Dutch Design Week a few years ago, and we were talking about the notion of the Anthropocene era and what was design's relationship to that. And one of the, Khalila Essaidi, who was on the panel, made this really memorable quote, which is that we need more science fiction. It's like, we shouldn't be, if we genuinely think that the creativity of people in the design community can make a difference, why are we fiddling around arguing about balconies and you know and things like that? It's like, what about the planet? I mean, this is a planet-sized problem. It's a civilization-sized risk. What's the big picture? Where are we trying to get to? I mean, what do we want planet Earth to look like in 100 years' time? I mean, literally, what do we want it to look like? If global warming does its thing, we know we can model what the coastlines are going to look like. What are the implications of that? What can we do about it? I mean, we've seen a few solutions pop up, like damming off the North Sea to create a lower level to retain the coastlines between southeast England, Netherlands, whatever. I mean, that's the kind of thing that we need to be discussing. I mean, discussing at least, because it makes us realize the scale of the problem. Same with rewilding. It's like, let's discuss whether we could rewild the whole of the UK. Just like Liam Young has made a movie which proposes that all of the population of the world move into an area the size of Greater Tokyo region, because they could all fit in there. And then the rest of the world could be divvied up between, maybe a third of it could be for wildlife, a third of it could be for food production, a third of it for power generation, for example, stuff like that.
Yeah.
Those are the kind of scenarios people should be putting on the table, rather than, this kind of tinkering with marginal things, which, like plastic bags, for example, and
do you think that's just lack of
wider cycleways or whatever?
Where I always say we go through that in cycles. I was thinking about, I was just doing a talk recently, and I was looking at, the kind of mid-60s, 67, 68, and you have things like, the Whole Earth Catalogue, and you have that great picture of, Earthrise. So it's the Earth rising above the moon. And suddenly from that moment, people started looking up and looking out, and you had that whole focus on, first ecology, first debate about small is beautiful, the realization about how we started understanding there were bigger questions about the planet being an entity rather than the planet being subdivided into countries and continents and whatever. And then jumping forward from that, we ended up back into looking in. If you think about after globalization, we started looking back in again. Things became introspective, and I kind of feel that's the bit when those solutions became quite small-minded in some ways. And I was looking at science fiction, and I thought, isn't it interesting that the beginning of cycles, science fiction always looks out. It was a great journey forth. It was Arthur C. Clarke moment. It was, time travel. It was always, in some ways, optimistic, and then it became dystopian. And we now live in a period where a lot of our science fiction is beginning to ask questions again about opening up. So it's kind of, when you look at Arrival and that whole cycle of Chinese science fiction writers now beginning to ask those big planetary questions. And I think it's interesting that I'm hearing similar things when I'm chatting to, philosophers, for example, when you're looking at you've been asked to take part in debates, suddenly those debates are about bigger issues. And I'm hoping, maybe that's what I'm thinking, not actually forecasting it, but I'm hoping that, to your point, that maybe having done that, because you were saying this is, ongoing debates and dialogues, is it possible that we'll start looking out again and examining those big questions and considering those big issues, not because they're bizarre or odd, but because we do need to consider abstractions to really get to big answers? Because without big questions, there can be no big answers. And the problem is, I think the answers are small because the questions are equally minuscule and the balcony question rather than the planetary question.
Yeah, and also the distractions are coming fast and thick, aren't they? I mean, so it's hard to take a step back and think about the big picture when Trump might get re-elected, when a no-deal Brexit might happen, when there's a second wave. It's almost like the news is doing its best to distract us and fill our minds with stuff which we have to deal with, and we have to think about these things in a day-to-day life. And so the bigger picture just remains a fuzzy distant. But like climate change is a certainty. It's absolutely happening already, and it's astonishing how little people are thinking about the implications of that. Solving it, I think, is definitely in the time frame of my life impossible. Mitigating it is entirely possible if we start thinking about it now. But again, like what do we want to achieve? Do we want a planet with 15 billion, 20 billion people on it? If so, where are they all going to go? How are they all going to eat? We probably have to sacrifice all of wildlife to achieve that. Do we want to swim in clean seas with fish and coral in them? Because that's rewilding. Actually, we want you jump in the water and there's no fish. That's like the agricultural equivalent of the sea. Do we want that? Do we want to swim in water that's untainted by creatures when we go on holiday?
Well, there's the thing, the Anthropocene age, the age of plastic. Maybe that's the future. I'm just aware of time, and I was hoping that you could ask me one question that I may not answer, depending on how difficult, because I know you always ask difficult questions. But if you want to ask a question, what would that question be? If you're kind of
if I wanted to, well, I'm going to ask a question. I'm not going to hypothetically ask a question. Okay, so what prediction did you stake a lot on that you got entirely wrong? But what was your biggest, or what was your, maybe we can depersonalize this. Like, what thing did we all think was going to become a thing that didn't become a thing? Which is another way of asking, which prediction did you get the wrongest?
I think that, well, the one I think is, and I always think, one is a time issue, and one is where it's just, it's plainly incorrect. And I always think about a lot of our work is based on how I would see the speed at which change will happen, and then the realities. And I begin to realize now there is a lag between my sense of, I guess, hope and optimism about something and what will come to be. And I remember thinking, the beginning when we started off, because before Future Lab, we ran Viewpoint magazine, which was, is kind of looking at design from the point of view of the consumer and need and requirement. And we absolutely believed that, the notion of flexible working and remote working and the choice of location would become fundamental. This is in 1996 that we were saying by 2000, and we pinned the date on that everybody would work remotely and live much more flexibly, and would travel to the office occasionally, but even then it would be negotiated at your whim, not at the whim of the employer, to use that terrible term. And I kind of feel, we were not just wrong. I think we had developed the forecast for wrong reasons. We were basing it on a lifestyle assumption, we were basing it on a technology assumption, and we were basing it on the how business would be done. And I think it was interesting that, we got the whole process of how long it would take to I suppose, rewrite the extremes of globalization, how wrong we were about the role business, the CBD. So I always think the mechanisms that we describe are still here. And it's interesting that we're still having the same conversations with clients about the role of the office moving forward, the role of the central business districts, the role of the city. And I think, God, it's, I don't want to go into this forecast again because I'll equally get it wrong, not because the forecast is wrong. You roughly get it right. We are pushing towards some kind of remote. We are pushing towards some kind of blended living, et cetera, et cetera. But I always think the speed at which these happens, I now realize it's 3 generations. And I think if I'm now to look at predicting what will happen post-COVID, as much as people would like to believe we won't go back to the office, we will. As much as they like to believe our city centres will be deserted, they won't. As much as we like to believe that we're all going to come out feeling more sublime and careful and clear and focused on well-being and health and being a bit more subliminal, that's not going to happen either. So I kind of... the learning from getting forecasts wrong is one to do with the forecast could be wrong. I think it's more to do with the fact that the time lag between the forecast and it happening is always greater than you think. The implications are slower and more subtle. And I think also this great hope that every catastrophe that happens, whether it was the Twin Towers, the GFC, COVID will make us better people is an unfortunate assumption of an optimistic forecaster, which the reality time and again proves. People will be as they were before. There'll just be a few more who think a bit differently, but not enough to make a great change.
But you got it right at the end, though. It's 20 years late, and it took a pandemic to force the change that you'd foreseen.
Yeah, but it's yeah, I just think, yes, it's good. So look, listen, really good to catch up with you. Thank you for speaking and kind of, I think, raising a couple of issues which I hadn't really thought about. The rewilding thing. I guess I'm slightly dismissive of it because I just feel it's yet another attempt to pull me back into the past, and I don't want to live there. I just feel it's. But as you explain it, I think you're probably hitting on a much clearer understanding of what that thing will be. And I agree with you about the stuff as we do it now, like the farming issue, is never going to make any difference. When I read Dyson, making his fields straighter and using drones to make them more effective, I go, well, that's a great cul-de-sac in history, isn't it? It's still not really solving the problem. So yeah. I'm going to have to think of a better answer the next time you ask that question when I meet you.
I look forward to that.
Brilliant, sir.
Thank you very much.
Talk soon. Take care.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
And congrats. Happy birthday.